Thanks, Joe. It's such a great honor to be with you because Barack Obama is coming to South Africa, where I've lived the last 23 years, in 2 weeks. And I've just learned so much that I'll feed back to comrades who are, I'm sure, going to give them an appropriate welcome, especially in Cape Town. If you're following news from South Africa, you'll know the protest tactics in the country with the highest rate of protest per person in the world have become very scatological. I won't go into more detail, but it's the first visit to the continent since Obama in 2009 fed a vast pack of lies in a speech in Ghana about democratization. And with UNAC, with Anna and Abayomi, with Margaret and Bar, you've got such great bullshit detection. I needn't add much more. I will try to put a few more points out. Pambazuka.org is the continental-based version of some of the Bar and the UNAC kind of work, so I hope you can all keep an eye on it every Thursday night. About 500,000 people actually read the Pambazukas. It's very, very good for the African left.
Could you spell that?
Pambazuka, Pambazuka.org. Pambazuka, Pambazuka.org. I'm going to say that there are a few slight differences with Abayomi on China and the BRICS. Tomorrow we take those up also at the session here in a couple of hours. There's a question we've been asking since we hosted the BRICS and the Counter Summit in March. Are they anti-imperialist or sub-imperialist or somewhere in between? So we'll keep that debate going. Will you come in 3:40 to this room here? The analysis you've heard of the geopolitics, the military diplomatic processes, I have no problem with, especially the North African and this extremely important report from Mali. Let me add, though, the democratization, neoliberal, pro-corporate economic policy and climate policy critiques of Obama in Africa must also be joined. Abayomi mentioned G. Menon Williams and his role in Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow. Williams' successor today, Johnny Carson, Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, said last September, quote, U.S. interests in the continent fundamentally stem from its interest in strengthening trade to help African states grow their economies and meet development needs. The U.S. wants to work with African nations to strengthen democratic institutions, good governance, and efforts to stamp out corruption and to spur economic growth through market-driven free trade principles. So let me just take that on quickly. I need not much rebuttal in a room like this, but we can certainly recall Washington's deregulatory free market support for Wall Street's binge, which in 2008-09 contributed not to growth, but the world's worst economic crash in 80 years. And the 1% took all the benefits from those bailouts that Obama and his predecessor Bush had arranged. But the most flawed assumption, I believe, is one I hope we'll all take to heart, that by increasing trade with and vulnerability to the world economy, Africa grows. You hear that a lot, rising Africa. It's front page of Time magazine, The Economist. A few elites have certainly grown rich from the extraction processes of raw materials, minerals, petroleum, plantation-based agriculture, but the opposite is more true. If we make a simple and quite rational adjustment to gross domestic product, growth, and that is to incorporate the wasting of Africa's natural capital, ghastly phrase of economists, but let's use it for a moment, because now there's talk of a green economy and measuring the natural resources, non-renewable, they get depleted during the looting, the extraction process. And when you do that calculation, Africa is not the fast-growing 6% per year continent. In fact, as even the World Bank will concede when they make a correction to GDP, the continent is declining by 6% a year, not growing. In other words, there's an absolutely irrefutable case that the nature of the extractive industries not just resource curses people and the environment and possibilities for democracy, but weakens Africa economically. And there's a new attention to illicit outflow of capital. Even ex-South African President Mbeki has put a commission together. But it's the licit, it's the legal extraction to the London, Australian, New York, Toronto-based mining houses that we must be very aware of. And that really was where ultimately Obama's role continues. And that means when there's talk of democratization, let's put that into context. That's talk left to walk right. Carson, especially, has taken the same neoconservative track of George W. Bush. We have one obvious example, which was Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, the dictator who was personally worth $40 billion and was the recipient of so much of US military aid, the most wealthy African recipient of military aid, but oriented to the military, right? Not to the masses. As Carson's boss at the time, Hillary Clinton, remarked, as the Secretary of State, "I really consider President and Mrs. Mubarak to be friends of my family." And she said this just days before the tyrant was overthrown in February 2011. Our assessment, quote, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable." As a result of her affection for one of the worst of Africa's big men, Egypt's democratic movement, core activists just turned a cold shoulder to Clinton in her visits in subsequent weeks again and again. The coddling of other dictators was signaled just weeks after Obama's speech in Ghana when Susan Rice, whom we've heard such a good critique of from Margaret, announced a New York luncheon with 25 African heads of state. Quote, "We're looking to have a dialogue with responsible leaders about the future of Africa's economic and social development." Obama dined with numerous tyrants from the continent that day. Only a few governments were specifically left off the list, Zimbabwe one of them, Guinea, Kenya, Madagascar, Niger, Sudan, Eritrea. But among the 40 were the Cameroonian dictator, Paul Biya, and his office said, quote, "At the end of the 2.5 hours that they spent together, most of the African leaders left the dining hall visibly satisfied." Democracy and human rights just were not on that agenda. The struggle of poor people to survive ignored. Another attendee was a Gambian president, Yahya Jammeh, a colonel who, after overthrowing a Democrat in 1994, later claimed to have found an AIDS cure. In September last year, came under renewed criticism from activists across the board after carrying out mass death row executions. And as one of the citizens' movements there put it, quote, "Given that Gambia's government uses the death penalty and other harsh sentences as a tool to silence political dissent and opposition, Civil Society Associations Gambia believes that any execution is a further indicator of the brutality with which President Jammeh's regime is bent on crushing political dissent." Asked whether, like the EU did, the State Department would oppose this and have some sort of response, they said, quote, "I think we haven't telegraphed any response at this point." One reason not to annoy Jammeh was the CIA's reliance upon Banjul, the airport there, as a secret destination and refueling site for rendition. I needn't spell out what that implies, but as Sherwood Ross from the Miami Herald has shown, 28 countries in Africa held prisoners on behalf of the US. That's just based on published data. So that's one of the other ways in which the AFRICOM role is becoming important. We shouldn't really have been surprised that Obama fit right into the Bush neocon agenda and amplified it, and as Margaret says, legitimized it. Before he was president, he visited Chad's dictator, Idris Deby, in part to press the case for Chevron, which Deby had just expelled for failing to pay sufficient taxes. Obama had infamously extended red carpet treatment to the oil-rich Gabon's kleptocratic tyrant Ali Bongo 2.5 years ago, in spite of unprecedented repression and corruption. As for Kagame, already mentioned, $800 million a year in aid, and in June last year, protection against possible UN censure for supporting genocide in the DRC. And 5 million people, at least, have died because of warlords seeking coltan and other minerals, and that's part and parcel of the way in which the DRC is being looted by US friends in Uganda and in Rwanda. We can get into more details if you like. Likewise, sending money to US allies in Somalia. Obama put more than $200 million in military aid there, and to the DRC, Libya, South Sudan, and Yemen, in spite of a 2008 US law prohibiting funding because of these armies' recruitment of child soldiers. The Obama administration, according to Human Rights Watch, has been unwilling to make even small cuts to military assistance to these governments exploiting children as soldiers. They're paying the price of poor leadership, Human Rights Watch. So it seems in sum that Obama's only opposed to African dictatorships which are anti-US or allied to China, but if you're a regional power within the sub-regions of Africa, or if you help hunt Al-Qaeda, or if you have substantial oil reserves, you may commit horrendous crimes and still get the prized White House photo op. I have a whole set of the photos from the White House of these dictators. Now, we partly know a lot about this thanks to WikiLeaks, which in late 2010 published more than 250,000 State Department cables. Bradley Manning on trial now deserves our permanent thanks and respect. Because more than your telephone records you're all very concerned about this week, what the WikiLeaks State Department cables demonstrate is how far Clinton, Bush, and Obama promoted, retained, or imposed the undemocratic regimes where these coincide with US interests. Just as an example, we know that a month after Clinton took office, she asked 11 of her embassies in Africa to collect fingerprints, DNA samples, iris scans, email passwords, credit card account numbers, and of course frequent flyer account numbers, terribly important, and work schedules of local political, military, business, and religious leaders, including the United Nations officials. This is surveillance state gone mad. Let me just suggest, though, as so many have already argued, that AFRICOM represents a major threat. Con Hallinan in Foreign Policy in Focus has reported that AFRICOM's track record has been one disaster after another. It supported Ethiopia's intervention in the Somali civil war, we've heard already, helped to overthrow the moderate Islamic Courts Union. It's now fighting a desperate rearguard action against a far more extremist grouping, Al-Shabaab. AFRICOM also helped coordinate a Ugandan army attack on the Lord's Resistance Army in the DRC, Operation Lightning Thunder, that ended up killing thousands of civilians. And then, of course, the Libyan story we've heard of, in which Washington and European powers also misled the South African government to support NATO's bombing. But this is what's critical about it, is corpses of US troops on African soil must be avoided at all costs. We know from the disastrous Clinton administration Somalia mission, that lesson for the Pentagon. So as General Carter Ham, the head of AFRICOM, explained in 2012, Washington, quote, would eventually need an AFRICOM that could undertake more traditional military operations. And he moved his command in that direction. Although not conducting operations, that's for Africans to do. This is Carter Ham. And writing frankly about this in a military journal called Strategic Studies Quarterly in 2010, the US Army Major Sean Cochran quoted a US military advisor to the African Union, quote, "We don't want to see our guys going in and getting whacked. We want Africans to go in." I think that says quite a lot, doesn't it? And that means that as we see much more, especially in Mali, especially in North Africa, of the drones, of the US military assistance, this is in the name of fighting terror. The very idea, I'm going to argue quickly, of terror is suspect when it comes to Washington. On two occasions, in 1994 and 96, I happened to work in the office of a man officially labeled a terrorist, a South African who was targeted by the CIA in the early 1960s. He was only removed from the US State Department's no-entry terror watch list in July 2008. July 2008, thanks to a formal congressional intervention. And from that man's experiences, we learn, I think, lots about Washington's whimsy, but about the Pentagon's embrace of an arms supply to people like Saddam Hussein. The man, of course, Nelson Mandela. And as Vice President Joe Biden labeled WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange a, quote, high-tech terrorist 30 months ago, hounding to the point he's taken up refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. WikiLeaks, again, shows its merits by unveiling, to conclude now, what the US is really all about when it comes to dealing with African dictators. Take Ethiopia's late dictator Meles Zenawi. Johnny Carson, according to the State Department cables, encouraged Meles to hasten steps to liberalize the telecommunications and banking industries in Ethiopia, according to one of the cables from WikiLeaks collection. An additional economic objective also revealed at this meeting, which was February 2010, was the destruction of the Kyoto Protocol's binding cap on greenhouse gas emissions. And that's terribly important because Africa did the least damage to the world climate and suffers the most damage coming up, as the temperatures will go up at least 3 degrees centigrade above what the rest of the world will witness. 9 out of 10 African peasants will not be able to grow fruit. Some of the estimates of the anticipated unnecessary deaths this century in Africa come to 200 million. And Obama's agenda this whole time is fairly obvious. Working with Brazil, China, India, and South Africa, I should say, in the Copenhagen Accord, is to destroy any potential for a global deal on climate. Because US corporations, the military-industrial complex, and the petro-military complex are so committed and addicted to fossil fuels. I'll just conclude now by mentioning that there is a lot of exceptional resistance across the continent. Maybe we'll take more time in discussion to review, for example, in Kampala, Uganda, US ally, extraordinary support for democracy from a movement in 2011 which looked like it might become Tahrir Square, not by mobilizing in one space, but by walking to work. Walking to work, and it became a national movement that Museveni, the US ally, banned people from walking in groups. In Nairobi, the People's Parliament and the Unga Revolution also campaigned for economic and social rights and had, again, mass protests in 2011, 2012. In Manzini in Swaziland, pro-democracy uprisings have been met with beatings, tear gas, hundreds of arrests. Across South Africa, you've seen the massacre last August of 34 mine workers amongst several thousand, simply fighting for higher wages. And we have protests at a rate now of about 10,000 per year against the neoliberal policies that South Africa is much applauded by Washington for promoting. Pro-democracy activists across the continent have been inspiring us, but they're also inspiring us because rooted in their protests is a critique of Washington consensus neoliberal economic policies. In, for example, Addis Ababa, where there was a day of rage in 2011, or in Zimbabwe, where 45 activists were arrested by the Mugabe regime for even reviewing Tahrir Square. Most substantially, perhaps, was Occupy Nigeria in January 2012, which protested the doubling of fuel prices mandated by the International Monetary Fund, a well-known tool for foreign policy, as the famous MIT economist Rudiger Dornbusch put it, of Washington. And when the head of the IMF, who's now on trial for corruption in France, as the former finance minister, Christine Lagarde, put it, we needed to double the fuel price in Nigeria. The result was a mass protest that forced Goodluck Jonathan, the president, to back down. Vast swaths of Nigeria's citizenry took to the streets. It became evident to Jonathan he would have to concede on the socioeconomic front or be overthrown from power entirely. To me, that's the sort of networking of the idea, not just of Occupy, but of the socioeconomic protests that are sweeping the world, demanding democracy and demanding justice. And your alliance has, over the years, the extraordinary history of African Americans in the US, the anti-apartheid movement, where I learned my politics. These are the kinds of things which can only draw us together more closely as the contradictions heighten. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We have about a half an hour for questions and discussion.